China cuts tariffs on $75 billion worth of U.S. goods as the nation continues to battle the coronavirus epidemic. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Phase one of the China-U.S. trade deal took effect on Friday, with both China and the United States rolling back tariffs on some goods. At the same time, Chinese officials are making vigorous efforts to assure the world that the coronavirus outbreak is under control.
This is a comprehensive battle. It is a battle that all Chinese people are involved in. Each person will take up their responsibilities. Each person will pitch in and play their part. As a country under the strong leadership of President Xi Jinping, a lot of effort is being made to ensure the health and safety of the Chinese people. Therefore, President Xi Jinping is personally overseeing this response against the epidemic.
There is much to discuss. Let's go straight to our panel. Joining us from Beijing via Skype is John Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics. With us here in Washington, Bill Lee is Chief Economist at the Milken Institute. Yan Liang joins us from Portland, Oregon. She's an Associate Professor at Willamette University. And also on set with us right here in Washington is John Setelides. He is a geopolitical strategist with Trilogy Advisors. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Bill, let me start with you in the studio here. China is halving tariffs on $75 billion worth of U.S. goods. The U.S. has, of course, welcomed that move. Here's U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien.
As we watch this coronavirus outbreak unfold in China, it could have an impact on how big, at least in this current year, the purchases are. But I think over time, the Phase 1 deal is a great deal. There's protection for intellectual property. There's commitments by the Chinese to reduce the deficit by buying additional American products, including agricultural products that you pointed out. So I think it's a great deal. I think it's going to be a very good deal for us down the road, but it may not have as big of an immediate impact, like year one impact, as we had hoped because of the coronavirus.
So, Bill, very positive comments there from Robert O'Brien. But how much concern is there that the coronavirus may hamper China's efforts to fulfill its commitments?
There's a lot of concern because the virus itself has really locked up the supply chains right now. We don't know how the supply chains could get unlocked. A good example would be this supply ship that's full of chickens that's meant for Chinese consumption, and it had to be diverted because there weren't enough dock workers to be able to unload the ship and plug it into a refrigeration unit to keep the chickens going. So one of the things that we need to understand is how well will the policies in China be able to unlock that supply chain, it bolster demand to restore confidence and allow the flow of goods and services to resume. And clearly they haven't yet.
What about the fact that China has halved tariffs on $75 billion worth of U.S. goods? That's going to stimulate something, isn't it?
You can stimulate as much as you want, but when you can't unload the docks, the boats on the docks, right, that's really the main constraint. So right now, the logistics is the main constraint, not so much the pricing and tariffs.
John Gong, this deal between the United States and China, it does have something called a natural disaster clause, which basically covers events or circumstances beyond the control of the parties, like this coronavirus outbreak. Do you see the United States and China perhaps revising parts of the deal in view of the outbreak?
Well, I think in terms of the purchase commitment, we understand it's a $200 billion commitment over a period of 2 years. So there's a little bit of a wiggle room here. I think what's delaying right now is, the amount of time that has been delayed right now so far is actually in terms of, 2 to 3 weeks at this point. But it looks like, this thing is going to drag on for a while. So, but in any case, experts are saying that, getting into the springtime when the temperature is higher, this virus is supposed to be subside and totally disappear. So I would conjecture that at most this is going to be an impact of, let's say, a month to 2 months. And a month or 2 months compared to 2 years is still manageable. I think the commitment might be affected, but I think there's enough wiggle room to fulfill this commitment. I think it's still too early to conclude that we have to invoke that clause, saying that we have to revise this deal. I think there's no indication right now that the Chinese government is saying that it wants to revise the deal. And I think President Trump is also quite understanding and accommodating. Is quite considering, saying that China is working very hard to fight this disease, and the United States would like to help. And I think the biggest help could be something sort of showing a sense of accommodation and understanding that there might be a little bit delay, but overall the whole package is not going to be revised in a very big way.
Yang Yang, how important is that Chinese move to halve tariffs on $75 billion worth of goods? We've got the Xinhua news agency in China, which quotes an unnamed Chinese official as saying that it is our hope that both sides will work towards removing all tariffs, of course. We also heard from the Chinese State Council and Foreign Minister Wang Yi. He says it's not just up to China, it's up to both sides. China and the United States need to work together to make this deal, make sure that it's fully implemented. Let's listen to what Minister Wang Yi had to say.
I do see one issue that will come up in the future. That is, given the U.S. comprehensive ban on people-to-people exchange between the two countries. Practically, that will bring up some challenges to the implementation of the agreement.
So how important is it for both sides, the United States and China, to work together to get over this?
This is a great question. I think this virus, if anything, really shows how the global economy and the countries are interconnected. I think it's very important for China right now to muscle any, to flex any sort of policy muscles and trying to really help with the economy. I think the previous speakers have talked about the logistic difficulties and so on and so forth. But I think there's a broader issues here because a lot of these estimates about China's economy's resume its pace is hinged on this assumption that the virus will be contained by the end of March. But that may not well be the case. So I think we need to really be ready for any possible scenarios. Right now, what we know is not only logistics, but also the protections is pretty much put on steel simply because there are 280 million migrant workers who have difficulties to make the trip to the factories, or they are either sick or they're quarantined, or they're just having difficulties going back to the factory. And so that's what we see, a lot of the delay in shipments, delay in production, and the really complete disruption in the global supply chain. And China's demand is also very much significantly reduced. We're talking about oil consumption that is down by 3 million barrels a day, which is 20% down than before. And tourism was completely cut off, and that again, I think, sent the shockwaves to other countries, United States included. So I think what it shows is that the U.S. and China and many other countries are confronting with this big common enemy. So I think both countries should really work together from trade to people connections to sharing information, expertise on fighting virus. I think all these are the common battlegrounds.
Yeah, you mentioned tourism. That's a big deal. I want to get to that in a moment. But John, let's talk about some of the other issues. John Sidelides. Big point of contention between the United States and China is intellectual property rights. Much of that is addressed in the trade deal and by China unilaterally, but the U.S. has just indicted Chinese military personnel in the hacking of a U.S. credit reporting agency. How does that complicate things?
The ability to compartmentalize these issues is going to be one of the major tests of the U.S.-China relationship going forward, both in terms of trying to implement phase one, which is going to face very serious challenges in China because of the coronavirus epidemic, also making sure that there's going to be the kind of focus on being able to negotiate phase two. I mean, this didn't just end. We need to go into phase two. There are some very critical issues that I think the Trump administration is looking to be able to close a deal on by November, not completely, and there's already talk about phase two being broken down into 4 parts, 4A, 4B, 4C, 4D. But the Huawei issue is going to be very important, both in its own right and as part of the larger issue of the technological competition between the United States and China, and many of the accusations by the United States against the Chinese government and its subsidization of Huawei, ZTO, and other breakthrough technology companies. So in this larger context, Anand, I think it's going to be very, very delicate based on what we're able to see between Washington and Beijing today. this whole epidemic is still shrouded in uncertainty.
Yeah.
We don't know if it's going to remain a 14-day incubation period, or now there's talk about, I think, extending it to 24 days. You have possibly, from reliable sources, a complete lockdown of all of the residents that are still in Wuhan, literally in the last several hours. And we also are hearing that Beijing is going to force the quarantine of individuals who've been traveling for the last 14 days, coming into the city, being tested and the like. So we hope that this is moving in the right direction and that this epidemic is cresting. But I don't know that we're there yet, and I think there's a lot of very optimistic talk that may be premature about this subsiding in March or April. All of this collides with our objectives on the trade deals, implementing phase one, launching phase two.
Right, John Gong, China, as we all are aware, is the world's second biggest economy, and it has close trade relations with the rest of the world, in addition to the United States. The Chinese are making efforts to calm markets right now. We heard the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, Zheng Shuang, and this is what he said. He said, "We believe our economic fundamentals that support China's long-term growth will remain unchanged, and we are capable of minimizing the epidemic's impact on our economy." In fact, international institutions, including the IMF and the World Bank, noted that China has enough policy space to deal with the epidemic, and China's efforts have effectively reduced the risks the world economy may be exposed to. So, John Gong, what else does China need to do to assure what are very jittery markets out there?
Well, it's just a very difficult situation, you know, and from China's perspective, we certainly would like to minimize its impact on the economy, but at the same time, we also want to contain the spread of this virus. You know, we have to keep in mind, this is not just a China problem. I mean, it's an entire global problem. It's you know, facing the human beings. It's unfortunate that this thing break out here. But I think it's also sort of, in a sense, also fortunate it's happening here in China because, you know, we have a very unique system here, a very unique political system, to the extent that we can, you know, take these very drastic measures. Some of these measures are totally impossible in some other countries, including some, you know, Western countries, to contain this thing. The quarantine measures, to lock down the cities, in the whole of nation approach to mobilize resources to contain this, you know, government providing subsidies. Now, you know, the government is talking about reducing rents for small and medium-sized businesses. In addition to the previously implemented measures of, say, you know, providing emergency credit and also reducing taxes, and all these measures are intended to alleviate the burdens on businesses, especially small and medium-sized business, and minimize its impact on the economy. So, you know, these are the things that the Chinese government has done. But on the other hand, I think, you know, we should also not attach too much sort of, you know, excessive fear about this. I think there's still a lot of debate about what really this thing is. And you look at what Singapore is doing, for example, they don't treat it as a sort of a really, you know, killing disease here. They treat it as a normal influenza, maybe a little bit of a severe influenza. They don't take, you know, extreme measures like has been done in China. So I think there's a lot of debate about the true nature of this thing. And also we keep in mind that this virus itself is also mutating. What ultimately it's going to mutate into, we don't know yet. But I think, you know, at least from the statistics we're observing here in China, the death rate, for example, for the people affected outside of Hubei province is very, very low. So ultimately, you know, we are not sure that this thing is going to have sort of a killing effect on the economy, in my opinion.
Go ahead, Bill.
You know, Professor Gong points out a very important issue here that is in all of the questions you've asked, which is there's really a bifurcation of views out there. The financial markets believe that it's just a lousy cold and you get over it sometime in the spring when the weather warms up. All the epidemiologists and medical experts say, wait, the downside risk to this bad cold is really phenomenal. The 1918 flu killed millions and millions of people in a way that we couldn't control. Yeah. That bifurcated view is something that is now distorting policy, because how do policymakers address this? If one scenario, it's just a bad cold, that means we should expect a very strong rebound and we should pump in a lot of fiscal stimulus. If indeed they have a downside risk of a supply side shock, which kills off millions of people. That's a very different kind of effort, including the contagion containment that China's going on. So I think right now we're at that crossroads of deciding how to go about conducting policy, and this inability to decide on what kind of enemy we're facing is really the main fundamental problem facing all policymakers.
John?
Because we are trying from so many different directions to get a handle on accurate information and what exactly is transpiring and what directions this epidemic is taking, we also are seeing a continuation of what had begun before this black swan. The epidemic broke out in December with the shift of supply chains out of China, largely for economic reasons, into Southeast Asia, into South Asia, and potentially into Africa as well. But I think you're going to see an acceleration of that shift because of the understanding now in the United States, especially on some sensitive industries and the like in sectors, such as the medical industry, where 80% of all U.S. pharmaceuticals are manufactured in China, and 80 to 90% of all medical equipment and supplies are also produced in China. So if this goes in the wrong direction and it's prolonged in a way that no one wants to see, but if this endures beyond April, May, June, and we have Americans dying because they can't get their hands on necessary pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, you'll see the U.S. medical industry begin to shift these supply chains very quickly, and you may see the same happening in European markets as well.
Yan Biang, the Financial Times had a report in which it pointed out that China's role at the center of global supply chains increases, of course, the likelihood that there'll be disruption from the coronavirus outbreak throughout the world. How big are those global repercussions going to be?
Right. I think like what your previous speakers have talked about, China is the important node in that global supply chain. And so when China's production slows down or even come to a still, then, from automakers to electronics makers, they're all basically suffering the pain, right? They don't have enough their inputs, or they don't have enough necessary sort of components for their final products. So that's definitely a disruption to the global supply chain. I wanted to come back to that policy question because we know that there are a lot of unknowns. It's not just about information, transparency, and all that. It's just we don't know. We don't know what this is, and we don't know how long this is going to last. And these kinds of unknowns breeds uncertainty and breeds fear, and the fear itself is real, and I think that is really what is affecting the economy. And I think we can't afford underestimating the severity of this disease, and so I think it's important for the government to step in. On the monetary policy aspect, they have done some liquidity injections, about $243 billion through the reverse repo, which is very helpful because 85% of the businesses there surveyed in a recent survey said that they have enough cash flows to sustain 3 months. So I think these kinds of liquidity, making loans more available, more readily, and at a concessionary loan rate is very important for these small and medium-sized enterprises to help them to sustain their labor force and so on. And I'm not too worried about, people would argue about debt crises and high leverage, because I think what they're trying to get right now is to get through this working capital and its operational cash flow. It's not to use the money for speculation or investment for that matter. And for fiscal policy, I think that it's even more important. Right now, the central government has given about $107 billion of grant to local governments to help to cope with the crises, the epidemics and the economic slowdown. But I think that's far from enough. I think this is the right step, but they really need to gear up and make more fiscal transfers to local governments to help them.
John Gong, we've also heard from the IMF regarding the impact of the coronavirus. We have the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva. She was talking about it. This is what she had to say. Let's watch.
We are still at the point of quite a lot of uncertainty, so I would talk about scenarios rather than projections. In terms of scenarios, the most likely scenario in our view is a V-shaped impact. In other words, sharp decline in economic activities in China, followed by rapid recovery, and a total impact on China relatively contained, therefore impact on the world economy also contained.
So, John, there has been a sharp rise in the number of cases since Kristalina Georgieva made that statement. But do you agree with her broad analysis that there could be a quick recovery?
Well, I mean, this is the pattern we have seen in history. As a matter of fact, there is actually a study that I've read about the impact on the U.S. economy as a result of the H1N1 virus in, I believe, in 2000. Is that 2010? I can't remember exactly. 2009, 2010, I think. And exactly the same pattern. You know, you see a sharp a decline of economic activities, recovered very fast. The overall impact on the GDP, according to the simulation done in that paper, is about 2 to 3%. And this is just you know, the nature of this kind of a virus. It is a low, what's called a low virulence but high infectious disease. And it tends to have an effect like that. So I totally agree that you know, this is a very difficult time. But once this virus starts to subside, then the economy will come back with a vengeance.
Well, there's something else. People are returning to work now after the Lunar New Year holiday. Reuters had a report in which it said that investors have drawn up stock trading volumes to 9-month highs. The government has injected $174 billion in liquidity, leading some investors to predict that the impact from the virus outbreak will be short-term.
Well, that's why I said there's a bifurcation of views, because the financial markets, helped by this incredible flood of liquidity, are starting to rebound very rapidly. And in some ways, I think many people are saying without the basis of fundamental facts. And so the liquidity-driven upsurge in asset prices is actually a very dangerous sign, because it doesn't show that there's actually recovery in the Chinese economy. When we see there's an actual lockdown in Beijing, there's a lockdown on workers coming in, there's a lockdown on all of these supply chains that are really the strength of China. So right now, I think the uncertainty about whether or not China is able to come back online and be the global supply chain interlinkage for the entire global economy, that uncertainty is what is causing people to be very nervous. And what we haven't heard, and what I would love to hear from the Chinese officials, would be, what is their downside scenario? If indeed this turns out to be a longer fallout than we expect, what is they can do? What is they can do to help the supply chains? Will China allow more imports from Vietnam and other places? Will they promote more diversion of production into these other Asian countries? What is the downside scenario? Because right now all we hear about is this nice V recovery. We pump in a lot of fiscal stimulus, and we hear nothing about what the alternatives would be.
Although we did hear from the foreign ministry spokesman who said that they're confident that China, what he said, has enough policy space to deal with the epidemic.
There's unquestionably that there's a lot of fiscal space. They can pump in a lot of stimulus. But when everyone is locked up in their apartments, when everyone is even afraid to order on Alibaba some takeout because they're afraid the delivery guy has a disease, that is a problem. So they're going to take that fiscal stimulus and save it, and essentially that'll be wasted. So I think one of the things that we need to ask the Chinese officials would be, how do we unblock the supply chain?
John?
What's fascinating to hear from our perch here in Washington, D.C. is that probably the loudest cheerleader in favor of President Xi's policies right now is President Donald Trump here in Washington, who seems to be looking to exude the same level of confidence in the Chinese government's ability to do their best to contain this unknown epidemic, right, with all of the uncertainties that are inherent in this. But I think also, as we look at the financial markets, they're hungry not only for data, but also there's a psychological impact here, whether it's marked by confidence or by fear. And I think President Trump is looking to use his bully pulpit to try to calm and reassure markets that this will work out in the end, whatever the bumps are going to be in the weeks ahead. But at the same time, we have the National Economic Advisor, Larry Kudlow, who's been critical in the last several days of the Chinese government's inability or unwillingness to allow American Centers for Disease Control scientists to join the WHO team that is on its way to China right now, and talking about the inability of the American government to get a handle on what exactly the Chinese are doing. So there's a little bit of a difference in policy between the top here in Washington with President Trump and his top economic advisor on the matter.
Yan Liang, you mentioned tourism earlier on. We just got a little bit of time left, but I want to get back to that. I mean, that's one sector that could get hit very hard. 150 million Chinese tourists travel internationally, and they spend something like almost $280 billion every year. With these, we now have travel restrictions, of course, and we know that thousands of flights have been canceled. How is that going to impact that industry?
Right, so the tourism industry is the one that is taking the hardest hit because of, like you said, the cancellation of tourism and so on and so forth. Thailand, for example, is in this sort of stalemate. On the one hand, they wanted to welcome Chinese tourists because they created about $1.5 billion of revenue for the country. On the other hand, they're worried about the transmission of the diseases. So it is an industry that's very much sort of hard hit. But the good news about this, though, is that once these kinds of demand could have some sort of compensational effects, which means if people cannot travel in January or February, then they probably can do it later in the year. So we probably can see some compensations on that lack of demand earlier this year. I would like to just add one last point on sort of policies and how we organize the economy in front of this sort of this illness, this epidemics. What I think is, the best scenario is going to be a V-shaped recovery. But at the same time, if we don't weather through this short-lived impacts, things could get really out of the normal orbit. Because if the businesses are closing down, unemployment rises, that would send negative shock waves to demand, and that would further drag down supply, and so you get that downward spiral. So that's why I think it's very important that we use government policies to help support the economy, help the small and medium businesses to keep afloat, and to give more subsidies and consumption and support for households. Even if they are not working, they don't get wages, they're still able to afford some consumption. And that also helps to help them to cope with the likely inflationary pressure that's down the horizon.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.